Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
It's always a bit of a crapshoot coming to periscope depth. So I came up in the dead of night and just had a green light, which is a starboard running light on my port side, which was basically a collision course. And it's quite terrifying for just a few milliseconds until I realized, thank God, it was just a sailboat. It was rocking back and forth, and it was very, very close. I had a recurring nightmare for a number of years after that incident.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to first-hand Cold War history accounts. Do make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. Former US Navy commander Henry Rausch is the author of Submerged, Life on a Fast Attack Submarine in the Last Days of the Cold War. Henry shares his experiences from training to life aboard a submarine, emphasising the challenges, mishaps and the camaraderie amongst the crew. He provides vivid descriptions of the rigorous training, the psychological demands and the technical operations of submarines, including navigating under ice and surfacing manoeuvres. Henry also discusses the toll his career took on his personal life. I'm delighted to welcome Henry Rausch to our Cold War conversation.
I actually had no intention whatsoever of joining the military at all. I was going to be a doctor. I'd want to be a doctor from the get-go, and I studied hard. My dad was in the Navy. We didn't have a lot of money. I studied hard. I got a scholarship to Stanford University, which was a good school to go to become a doctor. And the thing about Stanford, one of the good things about it, you got a lot of opportunities, and worked at the hospital. I worked for a doctor. I got a lot of perspective, and I realized that I would have made a very good doctor. But I realized, something about myself, I wasn't interested. It wouldn't make a good doctor. So I was kind of stuck with a very technical degree, very, very good grades. And at that time, that was the early 80s. And, the kind of the Cold War had been reheated, if you will. And there was a big surge, Ronald Reagan was, tear down this wall and all that. And he was building up the Navy, and they were looking for submarine officers. Normally the commissioning sources are the service academies and ROTC, but they had opened it up to the just regular universities like Stanford. And they had a deal, you graduate from college and then you go to Oscar Candidate School and go through about 2 years of training, nuclear and submarine training. And then in return, you spend 3 years on a submarine. And that just sounded interesting. So I just did it. That's the truth of it.
Being on a submarine, not sure I would have gone for that. But anyway, all power to you, Henry, with that. On reading the book, I really enjoyed it. There's a lot of detail in here and a lot of stuff that I wasn't necessarily aware of. But one of the things I notice in the book is that you don't have any names of either the submarines or personnel in there. Why was that?
Yeah, that was by intention. I had read every single biography and memoir I get my hands on, and a lot of them were very specific. And a couple things with that. There's a certain amount of readers, I love Tom Clancy. I use ANPDR 27 and all the techno jargon. One, I made a deliberate effort to not put any techno jargon anywhere. I just call it, the thing that made the water or something, just because I think that separates you from a lot of your readers. Another thing, I wanted to make a little bit timeless in that I didn't want to be about one boat. I really wanted to just, be a general story. I'm not saying I'm Richard Henry Dana, but I am saying there was a fellow who graduated from a very elite college, Harvard, in 1840, and he went to sea on a whaler, and he wrote this book that kind of encapsulated that period of history. And that's what I was going by. And the more I made it very specific, I think it would have lessened that.
And I think it works because I guess you can talk more about people in that oblique way because you're not naming names. You can't identify the people who you're talking about necessarily. So where do they train you, Henry?
So it starts out, you go to Oscar Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island, and that's where I met my wife, actually. We had 3 whole dates before we got married. I talk about in the book, we got married basically 8 weeks after we met. Kind of crazy, but there you go. We've been married going on 42 years this year. And then they send you down to Nuclear Power School in Orlando for 6 months of really intensive book study and exams and whatnot. And the book picks up actually in the high Idaho desert. It's quite fascinating. Maybe of all the mishaps and adventures America had in the atomic energy realm, starting from the 40s and 50s to now, exists in that desert. It's like a time capsule, and it's still working. They're still operating reactors, and they put them there in case they blew up. They just fry a couple rabbits, I guess. So that was 6 months, and that was kind of intense. And that's where the book starts. And then we go to submarine school in Groton, Connecticut, which is both the spiritual and the physical home of the U.S. submarine force. Not dissimilar, UK, like Portsmouth is like for the UK. And then I hit my boat. I hit my boat out. She was on a run in the Mediterranean, and I hit her in the middle of the run out there, and I was stationed on Charleston, South Carolina.
Can you just give me a little bit of detail about that training, because cover things like the damage control training, the attack training, and diving training. Can you just give us a little bit of insight into those and what that training entailed?
So there's a lot of physical trainers there that mock up. Obviously, submarines are, very technical. It's not like, say, if you were in the Army, you're out in the field or something. It's all about machines. There's a machine. It's not dissimilar from like the one pilots train on, and you're strapped into kind of a cockpit thing, and you practice controlling the ship. And it's mounted on gimbals and tilts all kinds of directions as a result of what you do. Nothing can, suffice for the real thing, but it gave us a good introduction. And so you didn't hit the boat, that was your first experience with it. That was very useful. There was an attack trainer where we would look through a periscope and see little models. I'm sure it's all computer generated right now. Back then, there were little models, you would practice making approaches on surface contacts. Most of our approaches were done by sonar, submerged, against another submarine. So you're all closed in. So that's probably the most verisimilitude, in that in real life, you're closed in a box, and you're getting your information through, basically lines that represent bearing and frequency. And you really have to develop a mental picture of the battle space. And we were drilled constantly in something called mental gym. We had to memorize the sign tables, and we would just do firing angle calculations in your head. Something the UK submarine officers do as well. They have a parachute course, that's their final course. And it's not dissimilar to that. It's probably less intense, honestly, than parachute at that level, but it's similar in that you practice, constructing a mental battle space in your head and, calculating fire angles for two reasons. One, the computers don't always work. And two, having that sense of being able to, I call it kind of a meta proprioception, kind of a sense of where things are with relation to you and the submarine. That really helps you, just to become a better submarine officer than if you just relied on the computers to tell you what you did. So that's attack training. Periscope. We had a navigation trainer where we practiced navigating the ship in and out. And then we had the maybe the favorite, I don't know, the damage control, which was a kind of a two-story mock-up of the engineering spaces. Engineering spaces are two levels. And it's literally, just a bunch of pipes with jagged gashing holes in them. And you crawl into there, and they shut the hatch, and they turn on the water. And, they're not going to drown you, but they're going to let the water get pretty darn high, let me tell you. And you practice sealing up those gashes so you don't drown.
Wow. You're really selling it to me, Henry. You're really selling it to me. Did you have to simulate trying to exit out of the submarine if it sank or anything like that?
That was ended maybe about a year or two before I got to submarine school. I think it was ended in the very early 80s. There was still a 100-foot tower, and that used to be, the litmus test. We did not do that. I think subsequently they built another trainer that, for your listeners, the submarine rescue trainer was basically a tower, and you'd enter at the bottom and simulate, it's about 100 feet, and you'd simulate on one breath of air ascending to the surface. And you'd have divers stationed along the way that would punch you in the stomach if you didn't breathe out. Because what happens is the air expands in your lungs. And if you don't continuously breathe out, which is kind of counterintuitive, you'll create an air embolism. And it's very serious. So there were diver stations that would punch you in the stomach as you went up if they didn't see bubbles coming from you. I have read that I think 5% of people who went through that had some level of air embolisms. So I'm kind of glad I didn't have to go through that, to be honest. They've got a more sophisticated trainer now. I don't think it involves exiting from that depth. But to answer your question, no, they had just discontinued that when I hit the submarine school.
Lucky escape then, Henry. There, lucky lucky escape. So you arrive in La Maddalena in Sardinia to join your submarine. Can you just take me through that day? Because is this your first time actually on a submarine at this point?
So during the recruitment process, I had been on a submarine before that, but that was more just a look at the impressive thing and glad happy. It wasn't, and I'll tell you one thing, you don't get the feeling of you're in a beast. You go, it's tied up somewhere and it's very congenial thing. Hitting the boat like I did over in Elena, it's a little bit different. I remember it very clearly the first day, the duty officer just brought me through, front to back and showed me all. And most of the things would either, drown you or blow up or explode or catch fire. And he didn't mince any words, about what to be careful for, not do anything stupid. That was my introduction. Yeah. The first day. It's kind of interesting. I talk about in the book that this is an era, and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book a little bit, because this era is gone, and I'm sure we're all better for it, but it was a different era. There was, something called the Rook House, which was leased by the Navy from an English expatriate. And it was where the officers all hung out when we weren't on the boat. We were basically rest and recuperation from, the rigors at sea. And quite a lot of bacchanalia went on at that Rook House. It was quite interesting. But yeah, that was my first day, was hitting the boat and then hitting the Rook House.
Have you been tested for claustrophobia or psychologically tested as to whether you're going to be up to be locked up in a metal tube for months at a time?
I get that question a lot, and the answer is no. I don't recall a single. Now, if there was, I can't say that there was not maybe some, testing that I was not aware of. That could definitely be possible, but I was not aware of any explicit psychological testing or anything. The truth is, one, it's all volunteer, so if you have any kind of proclivity towards claustrophobia, you just wouldn't anyway. Second of all, it's very difficult to become a nuclear submarine officer. You're vetted very extremely. Besides the academic quals, you're brought back for a series of 3 tests, kind of rigorous tests at Director of Naval Reactors, and then you interview with the head of Director of Naval Reactors, who Admiral Rickover, the founder of the nuclear Navy. I missed him by 2 months. He had just retired, and I got Admiral McKee. But it's very rigorous. So that's a vetting process in and of itself. It's not an easy course through nuclear power school and prototypes. So that's a fairly good vetting process. Not necessarily about your claustrophobia, but just whether or not you can stand up to the rigors of, a lot of demands.
How does your wife feel about this job that you're doing? I guess she knew about it when you first met her.
Yeah, I'll tell you, and I talk about that in the book, that makes or breaks. Well, now we have men and women in the service now. Back then it was all men in submarines, but that really made or broke whether or not a man could stay in the service. And I talk about some really sad cases where women couldn't take that and would just send these little messages, I'm leaving you, when the men were at sea. It's kind of cruel, but you can understand. We would be gone. 3 years at sea, I was probably home, in addition to being at sea and having duty on the boat, maybe 100 nights out of those 3 years. That was it. It takes a special woman, and it takes a special man if your spouse, if your wife is at sea now, because we have women undergo the same rigor as men do now. So it's even Steven. But yeah, it's tough. It's really tough.
It sounds like you had a similar system to the Royal Navy submarines, in so much you got family-grams, which was a one-way message from your loved ones of limited size. But I think in the Royal Navy, if anybody was sent what we'd call a Dear John letter, i.e. I'm leaving you, they wouldn't have actually given it to that member of personnel until they were almost home.
Yeah, that was a screw up. That shouldn't have happened. But nothing's perfect, and you're quite right. And yeah, there's very consciousness, and I talk about in the book. My wife actually gave birth to my son by emergency C-section, and their lives were really in danger. My son was born extremely early, and I knew none of that. They wouldn't tell me any about that till after I got in, for good reason, because everyone depends on everyone else. You have 100 men trapped in locked in a tube. And you can't have somebody who's thinking about anything but staying alive and doing their job.
Absolutely. So When you first come on board, you have an introduction to all the officers, and also you meet the captain. And I particularly love the captain's name.
Yeah, well, that was obviously, like, so I changed
or nickname anyway.
Yeah, so that was pretty close to his real nickname. So in order to publish this book, I had to get approved by the U.S. Department of Defense. It's a process. And they sent me a letter saying it was approved. And if you see the copyright page that says, the publishing of this book, the authorization or release by the DoD does not constitute an endorsement. That's one thing that you have to put in there. And the other thing is they say, do not use any what they call PII, personally identify information, without anyone's permission. I just change everyone's names. So it's pretty close. Yeah, his name was I think I call him in the book Holler and Herman. Yeah, and that was. That's a pretty common archetype. There's a lot of screamers in the commanding officer force, for sure.
Because obviously my impressions of submarines during the Cold War is the hunt for the Red October, and I particularly enjoy Bart Mancuso, the captain of the US submarine. But he's very quietly spoken. He's definitely not a hollering Herman.
Yeah, Bart Mancuso. Yeah, that's another type, and you get all types like you do in a lot of things. Everyone has different leadership styles. One of the pains I made in the book was not to paint myself as a hero and to show all the stupid mistakes I made and how the captain taught me, both by good example and bad example, how to be a better submarine officer. And I try to paint a really kind of fair brush on that. A lot of times it was very quiet, like you got to do this better, and a lot of times it was screaming too. So, yeah, it's a mix. And A Hunt for October was a great fiction book. One big thing I think any submarine officer would say about that one of the things you're inculcated in, not just in submarines, not just in the Navy, but in the military, is you obey orders. When you have orders, you follow them out. You don't interpret them. You don't decide you're not going to follow orders. And the scene where, he's got orders to take out a boat, but then somebody airdrops from the sky and says, don't take them out. I mean, that doesn't happen. You follow orders. That's what you do. You cut a submarine out. You cut anybody in the service down to their core. That's what they do. They follow orders.
I think that's one of the things I do like about the book is you have got it sort of like warts and all, the challenges that you had, but you found a quite a good mentor in the form of Bo.
Oh yeah, Bo. Again, not his real name, but yeah, he taught me, and he was quite an example. And there's a scene I relate in the book. He has taught me a lot. He taught me, I think, he taught me by letting me fail, and that's kind of tough to do. Like I'm a pilot right now, and I take people up, kind of teach them to fly sometimes, and it's very difficult. You're responsible for the craft, but let somebody else take the wheel, so to speak. You have to have a lot of trust there in your own ability. And Bo did that. He would give me all the rope I needed to hang myself. He wouldn't let me, obviously, but that was a very good leadership technique. And he also just had nerves of steel. There was a scene I relate in the book where we were driven over by an entire task force, and they pounded us with everything they could. We could hear the sonar through the hull. It sounded like the screams of the damned. It doesn't sound like the World War II, ping, ping. It's just a horrible screaming sound. Sonar is a lot more sophisticated than it was in World War II, obviously. And he just never flinched. He just watched that screen and just a rock up there in control. So yeah, he was a good example for me.
I love some of the descriptions you had of him. You said he chewed tobacco with a phlegmatic air, which I thought was a lovely pen portrait of him.
Yeah, a lot of tobacco chewers, a lot of, I think it's changed now, but a lot of smoking, a lot of tobacco use. We didn't get a lot of sleep. You need some kind of stimulant. They've changed the watch rotation now. Make a lot more sense. We were on 6 hours on watch, 12 off. In theory, 18-hour day, but not really, because that's not really your circadian rhythm. And we're always kind of in a sleep-deprived mode. The Navy's changed that subsequently. In 2016, they went to 8 on and 16 off, which makes a lot more sense. But yeah, you're always kind of in a half fog of sleep deprivation.
Which is challenging when you're going through the training. Do you want to just describe some of those challenges you had in your training?
Oh yeah, where do I start? Like I scrammed out the reactor, which we'll do that for training a lot. We'll drop the rods just to practice, bring it back up. I'd never seen that done based on a protection action before, but I managed to do it, which I didn't know what was going to happen to me, and that was pretty serious. But right before I was supposed to get relieved and go chewed out by the captain, we had a radioactive leak in the engineering spaces that we had to shut down all the hatches. So it was kind of bad. Radiation leaking to the engineering spaces. That's not good. But it was kind of good in a way in that they couldn't relieve me because nobody could come after relieve me. We were until we got that leak fixed. We were all by our lonesome back in the engineering spaces. And I don't know. The result was I don't know. Maybe I did a pretty good job on securing the radiation leak. That I didn't get relieved or anything for scramming out the reactor. And that was something I talk about at the end of the book. I think it's changed a little bit. I did see towards the latter part of my career in my next boat and also in the reserves that after the Cold War, we really went into this kind of zero defect, cover your behind mentality. And you really weren't allowed to make any mistakes. Any mistake at all was kind of a career killer. And I think that's kind of common when you go from a wartime footing to a peacetime. And I don't think I think it's common, but it's something we need to be aware of because you have this kind of risk taking attitude that's necessary during wartime, Cold War, whatever. We lost that, is my opinion, and to our detriment. Yeah, so I did make enough mistakes. Luckily, none terminal enough, but I don't think that was so bad. I think that's a credit to the submarine force then that we were allowed to. I talk about in my book. There was a guy who ran his destroyer aground. And normally, like right now, that would be a career killer. You run your ship aground, that's it. Game over, whatever. Well, the board decided, yeah, he ran his ship aground, but he's a pretty good officer. I think we keep him. Well, our nation owes a real debt of gratitude to that board because that man would go on to become Admiral Nimitz and lead us in World War II. And if they had tubed him after he ran his destroyer around, who knows what would have happened.
Well, that's a really good point. I hadn't realised Nimitz had run a ship aground in his early career. I think one of the stories I particularly, I don't know, enjoyed, I guess, during this period was the one with the torpedoes scare.
Yeah, that happened. And we were 50 miles off the coast of Charleston. We're coming home after a run. And the OD got, high-speed cavitating screws in the water, possible torpedo launch. And he didn't hesitate. We've got a kind of a code word set of actions we do when there's torpedo in the water. We go very deep, go very fast, and put the torpedo on what's called the baffles and behind the ship and try to get the heck out of Dodge. And he just didn't hesitate. It wasn't like, are you sure this or that? Because the thing is, he who hesitates is lost. And he executed that procedure exactly, immediately, and correctly. And in consequence, we're setting it for breakfast time and just destroyed all the cutlery in the galley because everything went to heck. And I woke up. I'd been awake for a long time, something like 2 days straight. I had a material problem I was working on. I was just dead to the world. So I slept through battle stations. They invited me to battle stations because I was just literally in a coma. And I just woke just walking through all the smashed cutlery but it turned out it was probably a drug runner. This was the 80s and the cocaine cowboys. And probably what happened, there was all these like ships that would come into the coast and then a little fast boat would, it was probably something like that. But I did that to make 2 points. One, the training, and two, people get hurt when that happens. So you don't just do that casually, but when you need to, you do.
Now, with previous interviews I've done with military personnel, there's always some incidents or pranks that go on. Now, I guess that's dangerous in a submarine, but they still go on, yeah?
Oh, there are, and yeah, maybe danger is kind of a part of the attraction. Quite honestly, back in the 80s, we had these. We don't have any more. They were basically, I think they're called water powered squirt guns, and they were very high power. They're kind of like a pressure washer or something, and the men would just play squirt gun wars in the engineering spaces. And the engineering spaces are designed to get flooded a page, so I guess it's pretty safe. But I'd be maneuvering and there'd be, these people running by squirting each other, and it'd be like a little guerrilla war going out in the engineering spaces. So So that happened. I didn't talk about it in the book. That's just an aside. One of the big traditions is messing with the XO, right? And I have a scene in the book about that. And like the earliest one is probably played on Noah, steal the XO's door. And the coda to that prank is the XO stations, an extra guy, an extra watch who would be sleeping otherwise as the door. And he has to act like a door. And you go up and you say knock, knock, and the door says knock, knock, and opens like a door. And it's all good fun. That story's probably been told 1,000 times. One run, our XO, his young son had given him a pound puppy, a little doll puppy. It was big back then. And they kidnapped it, napped the doll, and gave him a ransom demand, just like you see in the movies, cut out letters from the magazines, all good fun. And they had a list of demands they wanted, extra mid-rats, ice cream, that kind of thing. And it was all good fun back and forth. And it was kind of par for the course until there was an incident in the 70s, a decade before. John Paul Getty's grandson was kidnapped and wasn't being kind of recalcitrant. So the kidnappers, sliced off the poor boy's ear and sent that to him. Well, the crew did that. It's kind of funny now. It wasn't funny then. Sent the sliced off ear of the pound puppy to the XO, and the XO just went ballistic is a way to put it. And that ended and it turned out like they never did. They had actually bought another pound puppy and sliced off that poor pound, but they'd never touched the poor man's son's doll, which would have been pretty cruel no matter what. But that ended the prank. So that was kind of dangerous if it had gone sideways on that. But yeah, you got to do something to let off steam a little bit.
Now, I've heard of the crossing of the equator ceremony with Neptune, but I hadn't heard of the blue nose ceremony.
Yeah, all the pain and twice the cold. Yeah. They'll make a ceremony out of anything. And again, part of it's just traditions of the sea, right? So basically, blue nose is very similar crossing the equator. If you hadn't done it yet, indignation heaped upon you. I think they crawl through garbage. In the one in the equator. Here we crawled through ice. The theme was freezing to death, obviously, crossing the Arctic Circle. So we were just stripped down just to our bare underwear and just doused with cold water and made us sit on ice. And then the one thing that made it a little bit harder than a lot of blue noses is we would go on these missions. And again, for your listeners who are interested in the Cold War, back then we would go up and we'd stop at a spot in Scotland, actually, and unload these riders that had, certain special skills for our mission. And then we'd go and we'd do our mission and we'd come back, we'd offload the riders and they'd hop on another boat because their skills were in such demand that there wasn't enough for all the boats to go around. So these guys did a lot of runs and they crossed the Arctic Circle a lot. So they had, kind of perfected the torture to an nth degree. So they would make this concoction you had to eat as part of the ceremony, and it was just really, really horrible. I don't think any of it was lethal. We didn't have a doctor on board. We had what's called a independent duty corpsman, who's basically the equivalent skills of a physician's assistant, I would say. And he was tasked with our physical and our mental health too, monitoring that. But I don't think he would have let him put anything exactly poisonous in there, but one wonders.
The riders that you had with you, I mean, you're up in the Arctic, so they had some sort of specialist skills as far as listening out for Soviet activity, or what was their role?
I think your listeners could probably find more. I don't go into a lot of detail about what they did in the book because, like I said, I submitted this for approval, to the DoD to be published, and And for one thing, I like back at the beginning of this discussion, we said I didn't put specifics about equipment and everything. That's one reason I didn't go into a lot of details about what certain people like that did. Another reason I wanted to get approved, and everything I submitted was approved. That there was a couple minor redactions, but it was all related to the nuclear plant. None of it was about operations. So I think I cut the line pretty good. But yeah, we had riders. I mean, they had language skills. They had electronic skills. Obviously, you've got a platform that can be there where nobody knows where it's are, and it can collect information that could be used, to give our nations, success. God forbid if there were a war. So, you could kind of use your imagination what they did. I do talk about one scene on our run to the North Pole. We had a sonar rider who had very special sonar skills. And there was a scene I put in the book where we got some very anomalous active sonar transmissions. And again, I wanted to make this a book for a lot of things. One is show growth. And I didn't automatically put those bearings in the fire control and treat it like it was a hostile target. And the captain was very, very displeased the fact that I did not that. I had this guy that I trusted a lot. It was the sonar rider that said, "Don't worry about it. This is just an anomaly. It's nothing." But I shouldn't have done that. I should have followed the captain's standing orders and treated it like a serious event. But yeah, so we had different riders, some for sonar, some for electronics, some for language. Yeah.
You talk about learning your trade on the submarine. At one point, you have quite a challenge with a new XO who you're having to work with.
Oh yeah. We well, I talk about part of it. I think it's just a natural younger to older generation. At one point, all junior officers decided to go out and get motorcycles, which again, in the fullness of time, from his perspective, I totally see it. He didn't want to get a report that he lost 2 or 3 men and he can't sail the ship now because these idiots went off on a motorcycle. We didn't see it that way. We were young, so we could never be hurt in any way. When you're young, you don't think. But there was always that kind of friction, I think. Now I can appreciate a lot more, having been an XO of a unit in reserves in NATO. I can very much appreciate his perspective. But back then I was like, well, we're not going to get hurt. You're an old man telling us what to do. So I think that's just part of it. A lot of it's generational. Yeah.
When you're up in the Arctic, from what I understand, navigation is quite a challenge because compasses and things like that don't work properly.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks. I wanted some detail on that. That's one of the reasons I wrote the book. Was I talked to people about submarine, and none of them have any real idea, and that their main idea of it is Hunt for Red October. And that's something that's not really well known. First of all, I don't know about Navy service ships. I'm pretty sure there's no magnetic compasses on a submarine. So we don't use magnetic north anyway. We use gyro compasses, which are oriented to true north, to the, geographic pole. Gyro compasses do not work north of 88 degrees north. And the reason they don't is what they orient themselves based on the physical law called the precession that kind of keeps them spinning the same direction. But they use gravity and they use the Earth's spin to orient themselves to the geographic north. Well, the Earth doesn't spin. The farther you go north, the Earth does not spin. Like you spin a basketball on your finger, you can see it's not spinning where your finger is touching. It's the same with the Earth. So the Earth doesn't spin enough past 88. So your gyro compasses do not work, and you have no magnetic compasses. So the only heading reference we had was something we called SINS, Ship's Inertial Navigation System. And planes have it, all ships have it. The newer ones are oriented to a point out in space, and they don't have the problems we did. Ours was oriented to the North Pole, and it always stayed fixed to the North Pole. And the way you could see that, and I talk about in the book, SINS was a platform that was stabilized in 3 axes by gyros, and it was motionless relative to the North Pole. And it would move, like say if the ship went down the binnacle, and it was a huge thing. It was about, maybe about 3 or 4 feet in diameter. And it was located right at a ladder that went down into the lower level. And you would see that thing tilting. And it was an exercise in change of reference points, because what was happening was that was actually staying motionless and the boat was tilting around it. When we turned left or right in the ship yawed, this ball, this binnacle would move, but actually in real life we were moving around that ball. So anyway, so that's motionless relative to North Pole. Now, obviously that's a problem. If you drive over North Pole, the binnacle is going to try to turn itself upside down, which is bad. So we would live in an artificial reference frame. We would take the North Pole, slide it down the international date line to the equator, and we would call that the North Pole. So when we were at the North Pole, our charts would say we're at the equator in this new coordinate system, which worked just fine. The computers handle all that. But basically, the point I make is our single point of failure, our single reference, was this inertial navigation system. And if we lost that, we wouldn't have any any way of knowing which direction. It's not like you can steer by a star or you have no GPS submerged. There's no way, forget about knowing where you are. You wouldn't know where to steer the ship, because you had no heading reference. I mean, the way a submarine is normally navigated, you've got a gyro compass, or it's run by SINs, but you've got it says you're going, north, 000, it says you're going northeast, 045. And, you adjust the rudder. You're supposed to be going 045 and it's showing 047. You go a little bit to the left and so on and so forth. You don't have any of that if you lose SINs on the ice. You have nothing. You have no way. And that actually happened to one of our submarines, and I talk about it in the book. They lost their inertial navigation system at the pole. So all they did is they tried to steer straight south where they thought was south. And they actually ended up at the latitude they expected. But when they finally surfaced and got their gyros working and were able to take a fix, they were 140 degrees of longitude. In other words, more than a third away around the Earth, away from where they thought they were, because they had no heading reference.
Wow. Wow. I mean, being under the ice, you see some of these SSNs surfacing through the ice. Now, I always imagine that you've potentially going to damage the submarine there, but how do you do that calculation as to where you can surface and how do you break through the ice?
So you've got under ice, it's basically a fathometer mounted straight up, and you get a reflection at the water ice interface and a reflection at the ice air interface. That's the delta is ice thickness. So you have a very good idea of ice thickness. One of the things that I talk about in the book is you have these pressure ridges. The ice is not monolithic. It's all these big plates moving by the currents and by the wind, and one will ride up in the other and force one down, and the other goes up. And so on the surface, you have these towering pinnacles, quite beautiful, 30, 40 feet in the air. Underneath the water, it's even more dramatic. The deepest pressure ridge ever recorded, I was told during training, was 169 feet, which is a lot deeper than where you need to be you need to be shallow under the ice for two reasons. One, like you said, to surface. Another is to copy the VLF broadcast, and we'd have to make our way between these pressure ridges. And to do that, we had a high-frequency sonar that just looked straight ahead. It was extremely short range. It was basically a descendant of the high-frequency sonar we used to penetrate the Sea of Japan, the minefields in the Sea of Japan. It was basically a descendant of that. I don't know. It had more electronics on the front end. I think the transducers were pretty identical, actually. And we would actually station two ODs for that. We'd have one in charge, had what's called the deck, responsible for the whole ship. Another just in charge of giving orders to the helmsman because he couldn't have any delay. And it was quite tight sometimes to navigate between the ice ridges. So to answer your question, the surface, yeah, you have to be very careful. One of the things he would do is put about a 5-degree up bubble, we call up angle on a submarine. That did two things for us. One, it kept the screw down, protected, because you didn't want to, if you damage the screw, it's game over. You're not coming home. And the other thing is it presented just the tip of, we call it the sail. Most people refer to it as a conning tower. There's technical difference, but what you think of as a conning tower, the sail, that shark fin at the top of the submarine. If we went straight up the whole surface, that would be less pressure, less pounds per square foot. So with the angle, just the tip of that sail would hit, and it would give a lot more pressure to hit. So that's part of the answer to your question, how we protected the ship. We would put the fairwater planes, which are on the side of the sail, in what's called the under ice position, straight up, so they would cleave through the ice. It's probably classified. A couple feet is the short answer, is like what, the thicker it is, the harder it is, obviously, to break through. The early days we were up there are these things called polinas, which are basically open water leads. Like I said, the ice is constantly shifting back and forth, and they'll split, and there'll be like a little lake, and those were easy. We didn't have to pop through the ice for there. They were harder to get through the men onto the ice, though, for what we were doing, because, it's this whole thing about rubber boats. I don't know. I wouldn't want to try it. I mean, we just wanted to walk on the ice, I guess we're lazy. So we kind of snugged the sub, up against the ice to get men off. It was kind of tricky. Later on, all polinas froze over, and the polinas were a couple, and that was perfect because it was pretty easy to pop through, but it was easy to put men on the ice. And the final thing I'll say about servicing is sometimes you get to a point where the sail has impacted to the bottom of the ice, but you haven't popped through yet. And at that point, you kind of goose the ballast tanks with charges of air, and that will, eventually make enough buoyant force. You're lighter and lighter, and you pop through. You have to be careful doing that, because if you do it too much, the way that I describe this in the book is like, say, take a cup of water, invert it into with a little bit of air in it, and put it into a bucket of water, and you can see a bubble of air. You see how it's always moving around. It's all, as you tilt the cup, it's always trying to get to the highest point. Well, that's what's happening in the air in the ballast tank, is the air is moving around. And if you put too much air in it, all of a sudden you'll shift, and that air bubble will shift, and so the stable point is not the submarine with the sail hitting the top. It's going to shift over on its side, and that would be very bad for us, because if that had happened, we couldn't have vented, because the vent would have been below where the bubble of air is, and we couldn't have submerged. We'd be stuck there forever, I guess. So there's a limit of so basically, if you couldn't do it at some point, we just flood the ballast tanks and try again somewhere else.
Wow. So it sounds like really challenging conditions, because when I was reading the book, you had appear to have a number of sort of like incidents which weren't great for you there. I mean, I guess there's one where you surfaced too close to a floating ice station, which I guess isn't dangerous, but that your whole role is to not be detected.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just bad form to be counter-detected if you're on a submarine.
Yeah, and did you have a poison gas leak or something, and you had to surface?
Yeah, we had a freon leak. So, and thanks for bringing that up. So basically, being a submarine is very much like being in a spaceship. A lot of different reasons. One is you're very cut off. You don't get very many communications, and another is the atmosphere is entirely controlled. We would go for about 85 days without having any contact with the outside atmosphere. So we made our own oxygen. We had something called the bomb. We call it the bomb. It was, it would split the water into hydrogen and oxygen, hence, the bomb, the hydrogen part, like Hindenburg. But we discharge the hydrogen overboard and keep the oxygen. We would scrub the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It didn't work all that well, though. I mean, it worked well enough, don't get me wrong. But basically, the scrubber worked down to about 3.5 millimeters of mercury partial pressure. To put that in perspective of CO2, to put that in perspective, the CO2 level you and I are breathing right now is 0.23 millimeters of mercury. So 0.23 to 3.5, that's about 20 times, 25 times, the level. And that was the low level. Generally, we, depending on how many people were awake and working, you might have 4.5 millimeters of mercury of CO2 in the boat. So that was one big difference. We would burn the carbon monoxide off. We had something called a carbon monoxide burner that would burn that off. And everything else, we had to monitor very carefully what we brought onto the submarine, because little buildups could have a big effect that you wouldn't know. You didn't know the physiological effect of a lot of things. So we couldn't bring shaving cream on board, for example, because shaving cream, the gas, would build up over, 90 days and maybe have deleterious effects. So one of the things we had on the submarine, we have 3 refrigerating plants that used Freon, for just like your refrigerator in your car, refrigerator, air conditioning, all that, they use Freon. Well, that developed a leak, and that is bad in 2 respects. One, I think a high level, I saw a man carried off one time. We had a leak, and, it was in port, but his face was bright red, so it does have a physiological effect in high levels. But even low levels, Freon breaks down to phosgene, which is the poison gas they used in World War I in high temperatures. And you get high temperatures when you smoke. We had a lot of smokers. So, they were our Freon leak detectors, because they would, basically be breathing poison gas through their cigarettes if we had a Freon leak. So we had to surface quick. And yeah, we ended up surfacing way close to one of those towering ice ridges. It's kind of funny in retrospect, but, then it's like, wow, we sure surfaced close to this thing.
Wow. I'm too old for the submarine service now anyway, thankfully, so I won't be volunteering. The book is packed full of various incidents and stories. I mean, we've only scratched the surface here, so dear listener, don't think that you've heard the whole thing and you don't need to buy the book. But one of the ones I wanted to talk to you about, Henry, was when you surface near to a carrier.
That is probably one of the more fraught standard things we do, is just come to periscope depth. And the reason is because just like the ice, the ocean is not monolithic. It's got these gradients of temperature in it that sometimes we use tactically to our advantage. There's a term we have called a layer, where the water is maximum velocity, and that tends to basically act like a reflecting surface. And the layer, depends on the time of year and location, but that can vary from 100 feet deep to 200 feet deep or 70 feet deep, somewhere around there, right around where we want to go to periscope depth. And it, like I said, it acts like a reflecting surface. Sound above tends to be reflected up. Sound below tends to be reflected down. We can use that tactically to our advantage when we're hunting somebody, but it also has proven several times, more than several times, a good number of times, not just in the U.S. Navy, in the British Navy and in other submarines have come and collided with contacts they did not know was up there. And I talk about the several instances that happened historically. The incident you're referring to is actually my last time on watch. Coming in after the last run, I brought the ship up, and I did not know it because there was a strong layer. There was a U.S. aircraft carrier about 6,000 yards away. Not dangerous, but just surprising because we didn't know it was there. And I use that to kind of segue a little bit. There's always inter-service rivalry and inter-force rivalry. And submariners always call service ships targets. There's just submarines and targets. They're all targets to us. And I use that incident to talk a little bit about how defensive they are. One of the common submarine, things to do is, it's like the old joke, do you have any, naked pictures of your wife? Would you like some? It's like, do you have any pictures of your ship? Oh, would you like some? And you give them a picture of their ship that you took through the periscope, and it's got the periscope reticules on it, like, they were right in the crosshairs. And they hate that joke, by the way. Service ship officers hate that joke really badly. So, and I talk a couple other scenes. My last boat, we were supposed to actually kind of rendezvous with the carrier. We're coming back from a run, and we had operated with the USS America in the Mediterranean for 6 months, and we're coming back. And she was supposed to, we were supposed to be in the same area so that we would do some practice approaches on her. But the only thing I can think, and I can't say this is true or not, she didn't show up. She turned out to be hundreds of miles away. The only thing I can think is her captain didn't want any pictures, of a ship with like crosshairs on it. That's why he never showed up. Who knows if that's true?
I think there was one incident where you surface and you see a green light.
Yeah, that kind of haunted me for a long time. Yeah, because that's, like I said, it's always a bit of a crapshoot coming to periscope depth. There's been a lot of collisions. So USS George Washington collided with a merchant ship and sank her. She sank because of that. A couple of men died. There was I think it was a Greenville, did an emergency blow and sank a Japanese fishing boat. So yeah, it's always dangerous. It's always, and we have a code word, just like what we're talking about. If you detect a torpedo, we have a code word in case you come up and there's something close aboard to get the submarine back down quickly to a safe depth. And we were in the Straits of Gibraltar, and our tasking was to monitor for contact coming in from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean and follow her in. And had it, periodically on a submarine, you have to come to periscope depth about every 6 hours, roughly. Sometimes a little bit longer, but you need to have a fix to readjust the inertial navigation system, and also to perform things like copy the broadcast, and also just what we call like housekeeping duties, like shoot trash, and like all those things that involve opening holes in the ship. You do it at a shallow depth, like shooting trash, pumping sanitaries, things like that, blowing the sanitary tank that contains the sewage. So you have to come up by every 6 hours. So I came up in the dead of night and just had a green light, which is a starboard running light on my port side, which, is basically a collision course. And it's quite terrifying for just a few milliseconds until I realized it was thank God, it was just a sailboat. It was rocking back and forth, and it just It was very, very close. I don't know how close, but it's so close that it just swept by just before I could even call out emergency D. But just for a couple seconds there was absolute sheer terror. And I begin the book, kind of with a nightmare that, that I had recurring for a number of years after that incident. And I will say that since I published a book, I've been reached out to by a good number of submariners. One, very laudatory. It struck what I was going for. They say, look, you've encapsulated my experience, and that's all I wanted to do. But a couple of people have said, yeah, I was plagued by nightmares after I left the subforce too. So it wasn't just me, but yeah.
I can imagine. Did you meet any officers from other navies while you were serving?
I am glad you asked that, Ian. I'll tell you, I don't have any regrets in life except one, and this is it. And I will tell you what it is. I was on NATO staff, and we had a big NATO staff meeting, and actually I was kind of a junior officer then, but my skipper in my unit could not go, so he asked me to go in his stead. So I did so. It was in Toulon, France, and a lot of NATO meeting groups. There's always like, you have like canapes and hors d'oeuvres about 9:30. You have, meetings till 11:30. Then there's like a 3-hour lunch, and you have another meeting. Then everyone goes to a party somewhere. That was, it might be unfair, but that was my perception of it. Long story short, I was through all these meetings here today, and this was Toulon. After all this was done, I ended up in a bar, in a karaoke bar in Toulon, and there, dressed very nicely, by the way, with like, ties and everything, was Admiral Perron, who was, your UK readers will know this, he was FOSM, Fleet Officer Submarines. And he's like the head submariner in the UK Navy. And he had been at the staff meeting. He was there with his two, lieutenants who I guess followed him around everywhere. Long story short. So anyway, I knew Admiral Perron. He was a good guy. I mean, I knew not personally, but professionally. Long story short, he wanted us to get up and sing Yellow Submarine at this karaoke bar. And I don't think I had enough to drink, because in retrospect, I should have done that in a heartbeat. And that's the one thing I regret, is I did not sing Yellow Submarine in a French karaoke bar with Admiral Perron, the UK's flag officer submarines.
Brilliant. I mean, all good stories start with the line, I was in a karaoke bar in Toulon, surely. Was Royal Navy the only ones you really had much contact with, or did you manage to meet any of the other NATO navies?
Well, in NATO, yeah, you operate with everyone. We would, and actually, my unit was not just my unit, but other units like it were pretty important, because NATO does not have any intrinsic submarine command and control. They have to activate the reserves to basically do anything with submarines. And so we would be activated several times a year. We would go to Northwood in the UK. We would go to in Naples, the U.S. base here. We go to Norway quite a lot, several bases in Norway. Where else? Let's see. Mostly, yeah, Norway, the UK. We spent a lot of time in the UK. Anytime anything to do with NATO, with submarines for NATO, we would be activated for several weeks, and we would send out the tasking messages. I talk about that in the book. So submarines are very quiet, and they're also, that's one thing. And the other thing is they do not have, what's called IFF. It's not like in the air battle space where, somebody's squawking in code, you can tell he's a good guy. There's none of that. And so, one, it's very easy for two submarines to collide, because they don't hear each other till they're very close. And the other thing is, in wartime, in combat, there'd be no way for like an aircraft or a service ship, if you had a submerged contact, to tell if it was a good guy or a bad guy. They really don't have the ability. So the way we avoid submarines from colliding, and also what's called blue-on-blue engagement, is we have two terms for it: prevention of mutual interference and water space management. And they're basically the same idea. Submarines are given little boxes to operate in, and you do not operate out of that box. And a box, and I talk about this in the book, the box might be, if you're transiting, it might be, 10 miles ahead, 10 miles behind, 5 miles every side, and down to a certain depth. And that box moves out at a certain speed, a speed of advance, and you have to stay within that box. And, it might be, say, 13 knots, say. And when you go to periscope depth, you usually slow down to about 4 knots. So the box is going on ahead of you, and then you got to go down and keep up and get in the front of the box. And you have this constantly forward and back of the box. So as a submarine officer, as a driver, you live and die by staying in that box. And I talk about, kind of sad, there were 2 submarines. One was a UK submarine, one was a French submarine that collided, either because one of them or both of them were out of their assigned areas, or probably because the UK and French, wouldn't surprise me, didn't share the water space area, and they didn't know the other guy was there and collided. So anyway, the people that do that are command and control. So, after driving submarines, I went to NATO. My job was to write the orders for those boxes to keep all the submarines separated. And so it was quite important. It's quite fascinating. Yeah, I worked, cheek and jowl with a lot of UK. Spent a lot of time in Northwood, with Norwegians, with Dutch, with Germans, with French. French, at that time, I think they're always kind of in and out. I'm not sure exactly. There'd be liaison officers. They wouldn't be directly integrated. I don't know what their status is now, but all the rest, yes, yeah.
So, do you just do your 3-year service and that's it? You've done submarines. You don't want to continue?
Yeah. So I was actually going to stay in, but the Cold War ended, and part of it. So I talk about it was kind of more traumatic for my wife than for me, but my last run, my young son was born by emergency C-section. I didn't see him for about 3 months. And so that was, there's a lot of, and I just, how many more sons, how many children be born I won't even be there for. So that's one thing. It's tough. But the other thing was I took a posting at UCLA. I was teaching a midshipman there. We call it the NROTC, Reserve Officer Training Course. And that's when the Berlin Wall fell. And we had built up the Submarine Officer Corps to staff about 100 fast-tack submarines, and they cut that in half to about 50. And they didn't really need a lot of us officers anymore, and my chances for command, were a lot less because of that. I mean, maybe I could, but the other thing I did notice, like we talked about earlier, the tenor after the the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union fell was a lot different. There was a lot more kind of cover your behind mentality. And basically I did one more tour as a weapons officer on another fast-tack submarine, and then got out about the mid-career point and stayed in the reserves. I worked with NATO, ended up retiring as a commander from the reserves. One last thing, I do want to give a shout out to, there was a UK submarine officer I have the utmost respect for. He rowed our boat on the last run. He had been a diesel submarine skipper, because the UK had Oberon-class submarines at that time, and he was going to take, I think he took command either of an S-boat or a T-boat. I can't remember which. Anyway, I cannot say enough about that man. I won't use his name. He went on to become a pretty high admiral, I think a rear admiral or something in the UK Navy. But he rowed our boat, and he gave me a lot of good guidance, and he was quite a mentor. And I still have his dolphins, actually, that he gave me. He's just a hell of a person. I won't use his name. He's got a fake name in the book. So probably of all the navies, UK and the US Navy are the most integrated. Absolutely, no question whatsoever. And we would have British submarine officers, ride our boat with us on our run.
And long may it remain that way as well. The book is called Submerged, Life on a Fast Attack Submarine in the Last Days of the Cold War by Commander Henry Rausch, US Navy Reserve, retired. I will provide links in the episode notes so you can get hold of that, but it's well worth a read. It's not like a lot of submarine books you've probably read. This is a bit more warts and all, I would say, story, but a lot the richer for it.
I just want to thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to listening to this podcast, and thank you very much, Ian. Thank you for the opportunity.
The episode extras, such as videos, photos, and other content, are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and look forward to seeing you next week.